Welcome. This part on the project of violence as a tool to the British Empire from the 18th century to the early 20th century will be covering the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, continuing on from the previous presentation about India. This one was put together by Anna Hardman. Now, in the final section of this series, addressing whether violence was a main tool used by the British Empire to maintain its power, we will be returning back to India to look at a specific event that took place on April 13th, 1919. A series of strikes and protests followed the passing of the Rowlatt Acts in early 1919, which extended the repressive wartime legalization measures which had been put in place during the First World War. On April 10th, violent protests outbroke in Amritsar due to the news that prominent Indian leaders had been arrested and banished elsewhere in the country as a British response to the strikes and outbreaks of protest. This led to the introduction of a law to ban all public gatherings. It was enforced by General Dyer, who had been placed in charge of restoring order in Amritsar. However, on April 13th, 1919, 15 to 25,000 natives gathered to celebrate Massacre, an Indian spring festival at Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar. Under the orders of Dyer, soldiers fired at the crowd without warning. This left 530 dead and 1,200 wounded. So what's the significance of this event? As it's been explored throughout the series, violence such as what has been seen in this event happened all throughout the history of the British Empire. So what's the significance about this particular one? It's been argued by some that the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh was a turning point that led to the end of British rule in India. But how? Well, the massacre sparked intense retaliation. In Britain, there was a divide in the reactions towards the actions General Dyer took. Some condemned Dyer's actions, including Sir Winston Churchill, who publicly spoke of his disapproval, describing the event as monstrous during a speech. However, others, such as the House of Lords, praised Dyer. The diplomatic response from the British government in India was the introduction of martial law in Punjab. Martial law simply allowed for more violence, such as looting and public whippings, to take place. The massacre made headlines worldwide. A reason for why this particular event can be seen as a turning point is because of the world stage that was now available. The advancements in technology in the 20th century allowed for mass production of news, radio communications, and many had heard and frowned upon the massacre, calling it an injustice. For the Indians, the massacre and Dyer were symbols of colonial injustice and violence, and sparked huge resistance. Gandhi returned to lead protests and movements against the British, after having supported them throughout the war. For example, Gandhi advanced the non-cooperation campaign. This event shows that when faced with gatherings that broke the law, the initial response of British officials was violence, and support that was given by the House of Lords showed that it wasn't just General Dyer who acted out of violence. Violence was a key tool of the British to maintain their power within their colonies. Even their diplomacies were rooted with violence, and their response to any strikes, protests, no matter if they were peaceful or not, was violence. On the other hand, it's important to address the point of view which is held by some historians that violence seen in the massacre was simply a response to the breaking of the law. However, in a quote from General Dyer, he expressed that it was no longer a question of dispersing the crowd, but one in producing a sufficient moral effect from a military point of view. Meaning that the act of violence wasn't a response to the breaking of the law alone, but it was more to evoke fear and spread a message to the people who were disobeying. Furthermore, these ideas and beliefs that Dyer held were described as very British determination, drawing on the fears of a repeat of the 1857 rebellion, which we mentioned earlier. The determination was to keep control by means of violence. Resistance increased in correlation with the continuing violence from the British. In a way, the violent nature of the British Empire was a mean to its own end. As resistance continued towards the violence, there was a decline in the control of the British Empire in India, eventually leading to their decolonisation. This suggests the main tool for control was indeed violence. Here's the bibliography for this section, and after this we're going to be looking at our conclusion, so go watch that video. Thanks.